Today's session is about gender, sexuality, and the body. Okay, so hopefully you've all done the reading for this week. These are the two texts that we asked you to read. And the plan for today is that Cordy and I will start by kind of setting the scene. And then we're going to segue into a more interactive session where you can discuss the case studies that you gathered as your bridging activity this week. So, yeah, I'll quickly read through the introduction and objectives here. So we're here today to explore gender and sexuality in relation to health, healthcare, and the body, to consider gender, sexuality, the body, and health in our different contexts, to identify how, in the contemporary moment, different versions of the body are being mobilized politically, and to develop a working answer to what does a healthy environment feel like, by arguing a healthy environment is one where bodies are not under threat, bodies are not targets of state regulation, bodies feel a sense of safety and belonging, and where political rhetoric aligns with lived experiences. Okay. So before we properly begin, I thought it would be important to mention that we will be discussing sensitive and complex topics today. And so I think we should come up with a safer spaces agreement together. So I'll read out my thoughts about what that looks like, and you can let me know if there's anything here that you don't agree with or anything that you would like to add before we get going. So, okay, so throughout the session, let's all speak from our own experiences and let other people do the same. Let's assume good intentions while being aware of the effects that our words might have. Let's recognize that discomfort can be part of learning, but harm is not. So take breaks if and when you need to throughout the session. And please, let's just all take care of each other throughout the session. Okay. Anything else? Anything that anyone would like to add to that? You could raise your hand or type in the chat. Maybe Michael could read out anything that comes up. No. Okay. Okay, lovely. All right. Okay, let's move on. Okay. Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm handing over to Cordy to kick us off.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Gemma, you actually froze for me when you were introducing me. That's the only time you froze, and I don't know if it froze for anyone else, but I don't know what amazing things you were saying. But just to kind of reintroduce myself, my name's Cordelia Freeman, and I'm a feminist political geographer here in the geography department at Exeter. I work particularly on reproductive justice in Latin America, and most of my work has been looking at abortion rights, abortion access, in contexts where abortion is criminalized or severely restricted. A lot of my work is with activists who support people to access abortion pills in those contexts and what that looks like. So I'm going to be getting into a little bit more of these examples at the end of this. But what I want to start out by doing is kind of mapping out some of the political things which are going on right now in terms of the topics that we're really interested in today's session. And as Gemma mentioned in the last slide, there's a lot of very challenging, emotionally charged topics in the kind of things I'm going to be talking about. So if you need to, not look at the screen for a bit, if you need to kind of take some time, of course, there's no problem at all with that. So it's also very interesting thinking across the different geographical contexts where we are, thinking particularly around something like abortion and abortion rights and what abortion access looks like in practice amidst those rights. So I'm pretty sure everyone on the call is quite aware of the Dobbs decision, which has repealed Roe v. Wade in the United States. So I, like many other abortion researchers, don't see Roe v. Wade as this kind of perfect legal apparatus that made abortion wonderful and accessible for people, because it didn't. But it it was certainly a better position than what we've been seeing post Dobbs. So this has been kind of this watershed moment where I think we've seen a lot more attention given to abortion than previously. I think it's interesting where lots of you, well, some of you being here in the UK, less politicized, less fraught in terms of thinking about abortion, um, but I wouldn't say less legally complex. So abortion in the UK is technically illegal. We have the Abortion Act. That means that you can go to the NHS, which is our National Health Service, and if two doctors approve that you can have an abortion, you can have one on a broad spectrum of grounds. So it's possible and it's free, and plenty of people will have an access to an abortion in that way. However, if I access the abortion pills, misoprostol, mifepristone, exactly what I'd be given by a doctor, and I take them myself, I could go to prison. And anyone who supports me in that could go to prison. And we have seen in the last few years a really serious upsurge of people being having court cases about their self-managed abortions. So even though it's less politicized in the UK, we still have this very fraught legal landscape. And so what we're seeing right now, particularly in this post-Dobbs world, is the way in which different states in the US are interpreting that law. So there's quite an interesting set of literature in the abortion world about legal interpretation of abortion laws. And we're seeing, for example, here you can see in the middle of a screen there, places like North Dakota following the strictest interpretations, where we have other states who are pushing back against that. You can see down in the kind of bottom center there, there's an article there about the implications this is having on people's lives. So we're seeing very serious health impacts as a result of restricted access to abortion, people who are unable to access miscarriage care, for example, people being the surveillance around people who are having abortions, and the measures that people are having to go through to have their own abortions, or are just unable to ever have one. This isn't obviously just a US issue. So down on the bottom left there of the screen, you can see how Central America is one of the places in the world with the most strict abortion laws, but also very strict social codes around those laws. So this is a big difference between different countries about the law, but actually what it looks like in practice. So in Central America, we see, for example, people who have been imprisoned for perhaps decades because they've had a miscarriage, and someone has suspected that that was actually a self-managed abortion. This is also important in terms of the broad understandings of science. So the silencing, the epistemic silencing around abortion has these huge ramifications for abortion, but also other health issues as well. So Ms. Magazine have a really recent three-part series where they're looking at the impacts of there not being testing with the abortion pill mifepristone. So as you can see the front cover there, mifepristone more than just an abortion pill. There are researchers who are looking at for a range of other healthcare treatments, such as fibroids, such as endometriosis, the use of it as a contraceptive pill, for example. And we see this also with what's termed the other abortion pill, misoprostol. So that's really important in postpartum hemorrhage care. But because these are tagged as abortion drugs, they're so stigmatized and controversial that it's really hard to actually use them for any other uses or to test them. So, for example, the company who held the patent of misoprostol called Searle, they refused to make a placebo so that you couldn't use it in medical trials. So the medical knowledge that is being stymied because of the stigma around abortion pills is really significant. So we're interested in these kind of reproductive issues this week, but abortion is just one of those. And we're also interested in understandings of gender, and the way in which we're seeing that. Sorry, Gemma, can you move to the next slide? Is attacks on trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people across the world. So again, very difficult, emotionally charged topic, but we're seeing in places like the UK, we're seeing rises in hate crimes. We've been seeing increased legal attacks on trans people and people's right to public life. We're seeing, similar things happening in the US, of course. Uh, you know, not being able to access medical care, not being able to have ID documents that actually match your gender, these constant chipping away against people's right to public life and dignity, and the levels of violence which are going that. And if we think about the kind of the full spectrum of what violence can be, we're seeing hate crimes, we're seeing attacks, we're seeing murders, as you can see with the example there of people in Pakistan, as well as those legal attacks which are just chipping away at people's rights. So this is like the broad context for what's happening in just these two examples of thinking about abortion and thinking about trans lives. Gemma, can you move on to the next slide? Thank you so much. So the one of the readings that we asked you to look at for this week was called Reproductive Governance Redux. And what I want to talk about today is how this can be a useful framing for understanding these issues which are going on today. So I don't know if any of you had come across the term reproductive governance before, but it was first used in 2012 by Lynn Morgan and Elizabeth Roberts, who work on reproduction in Latin America. And how they defined it back then was looking at the actors behind a range of strategies. And by actors, they mean huge variety of actors. So the state, religious groups, financial institutions, NGOs, social movements, and how they use a range of strategies to control reproduction and to control populations. And so these strategies are, again, really broad. It might be law, it might be financial, it might be what they call moral injunctions, but it can also be things like direct coercion, violence, and ethical incitements. So thinking about this kind of the whole societal possibility of how reproduction and population can be governed. And the reading that we gave you is a more recent piece where, sorry, slide, Gemma, where Lynn Morgan has tried to map out some relatively recent, 2019 now, but a lot of it still maps onto what we're seeing today. Patterns where we're seeing this come up again and again. And they're showing, we came up with this idea and it's almost become clearer and more strong how this is coming through. And Morgan sets out just a few different ways, and she gives some really nice empirical examples in the paper. And here are just some of the things she talks about. The idea of this trend towards lawmaking in the governance of reproductive lives, what she calls judicialization or lawfare. So lawfare is a portmanteau, so bringing together of two words, law and warfare, and the way in which the law is being used to attack particular communities. So she talks about abortion bans as being one really clear example of that. And this idea that I think there's a general assumption for a lot of people, or there was until Dobbs, that there's this linear progress with things like abortion law. But what we're seeing is like the pendular nature of law, but it's actually much more fragile. So we're seeing that in the US, we're seeing that in Poland, we're perhaps seeing that in Argentina being chipped away. But I think we can also apply a lot of this to what we're seeing about lawfare against trans people as well. The second point she talks about is the nexus of economics and politics. So a lot of this is around the role of financial global health initiatives. So there's been a lot about global health as news with the Epstein files coming out. What Morgan talks about here is how individuals get criminalized for taking abortion pills. So like the examples I gave, we're seeing this in the UK, we're seeing this in the US, in many countries where people are taking abortion pills. The individual who takes them to manage their own reproductive life is the person who becomes criminalized. But the companies who are making these in, their millions, they don't get targeted at all. She also talks about the examples of how we see abortion clinics of these specific small spaces getting overregulated, because these are the places you need to govern. That the US fertility industry is almost this wild west of people being able to access assisted reproductive technologies because there's a huge amount of money in that. And that's very useful for the pro-natalist agenda. And then the third one she talks about is the rise of religious nationalism. So again, seeing this come through really clearly in the US, the linking of political groups with religion around what family is, who can be a family, what it means to be a woman, what it means to have children. And I think this links really nicely to the Butler introduction as well. Slide, please, Emma. And this was briefly mentioned in the piece by Morgan, but I think is worth kind of unpacking a bit more, which is this idea of stratified reproduction. So this is a fairly old term now by Shelley Colin, but has been really useful as this conceptual framing for how we have, on the one hand, some people's reproductive lives being incredibly governed and controlled, and people being denied the right to have children, whereas other people are being forced to have children. How can that be happening at once? What Colin says is this is stratified reproduction, where some people's reproductive futures are encouraged while other people's are denied. And we need to see these as two sides of the same coin rather than two opposing governance strategies around reproduction. So we see on the one hand this antinatalism. So this is when people's reproductive futures are being held back, being denied. And we know the populations that get governed within populationism, they're not white, middle class, university educated populations. They tend to be poor, low income communities in a variety of different kind of global South countries where they're seen as having too many children and their fertility is something that needs to be controlled. And this is all about engineering a specific narrative of the future where you have people who are more likely to be able to work, fewer future populations that you don't want. And it's also been seen as a way of dealing with the threat of migration in the future, preventing the people from being born who you're worried about entering your country. And we see this through a range of strategies like the forced use of contraceptives, so long-acting reversible contraceptives in particular that we see being rolled out, and forced sterilization. Really clear examples, places like Puerto Rico where that's happened, India, Peru, many examples around the world. And yet at the same time, we have this really clear narrative of pronatalism. We're seeing this in the US, we're seeing this in the UK, we're seeing this in particularly predominantly white spaces of white supremacy, a lot of us are overlapping with the manosphere, which is all about promoting the fertility and reproductive possibilities of this white, educated, middle, upper class countries in the global north to engineer their specific narrative of what the future should look like. We see this around tax breaks, financial incentives to have more children. We see tax break Hungary is doing that at the moment. I think it was Russia that's had this idea of having medals for women who've had a certain number of children. Really investing funding in reproductive technologies, so IVF, for example, while also restricting people's right to have an abortion, so that if people do become pregnant but don't want to be, it's harder for them to not have that future population that you want. I don't know if anyone saw in the news in France this week that they're sending out a letter to all 29-year-olds to remind them of the implications of waiting to become pregnant, which just seems like an absolutely wild decision. I don't know who's going to receive that letter and think, oh, right, cool, I'm going to have a child. But that has been their decision. So we see this happening in these global north countries. So next slide, please, Gemma. So what I kind of want to argue is that these ideas of reproductive governance and stratified reproduction, they are dealing explicitly with reproductive issues. But I think they map on very clearly to the control around gender, to the attacks on trans people's lives and non-binary people's lives that we're seeing. And so all of these kind of, with the brief few things I've put on the slide here, we can understand these are the same patterns of governance and the ways in which stratification is happening, that we're seeing these two sides of the same coin for who is able to access healthcare, access treatments, who's allowed to live, while other people are being denied that. So we see this through things like who is able to access contraception or not, where's that funding for contraception, the coercive use of long-acting reversible contraceptives, and despite their controversies and health issues, of course, abortion bans and these legal attacks on trans people's lives and their right to public space. We can see it through forced sterilization and forced intersex surgeries. So how people are both forced into these invasive surgical procedures without their consent, often when they're very, very young, while trans people are denied gender affirming healthcare. The blocking of gender recognition processes, so, for example, not being able to have an X on your passport in the US, and a huge range of anti-LGBTQ plus policies. And so I think we can kind of see these under this umbrella of the way in which governance is happening. So last slide, please, Gemma. So really depressing, everything I've been talking about, and the way in which like this governance is happening across these different geographical contexts. So I just wanted to kind of end with a note of how this is being resistance, thinking a little bit more perhaps what's the way out of this. So in terms of abortion, what we've been seeing post-Dobbs in the US is the rise of activists making sure people can access pills. So there are two ways of having an abortion with pills, mifepristone and misoprostol, or a minor procedure called a procedural abortion. About 2/3 in the UK now are abortions with pills, very safe, very effective, safer than Viagra, safer than penicillin. So organizations like Aid Access and Plan C have been rolling out these ways of getting people pills in order to democratize who gets a right to abortion when that has been denied by the state that they're in. So this is happening through the big organizations like Aid Access and Plan C, but we're also seeing it in much smaller ways because there's long histories, this is what I write about in my own work, of people accessing abortion pills and self-managing their own abortions across Latin America. And that's particularly because one of the abortion pills, misoprostol, was actually designed as a stomach ulcer drug. And so it's available, you can buy it, you can sell it, you can use it legally as a stomach ulcer drug. And so it's much more easy to mobilize and to move between activist groups. So there's been quite a lot in the news lately about how activists in Mexico who've got this long history of doing this are now translating that and supporting people in the US to have abortions. And then kind of similarly, we're seeing trans people who are being denied access to gender affirming care doing DIY sexual and reproductive health. I wanted to get like a better example than this article I've got by Open Democracy, because it's like a bit stigmatizing, isn't it? With it's like unregulated grey market for hormones when they're exactly the same hormones that people would be getting, through a healthcare provider if they didn't have terrible waiting lists. But we're seeing kind of similar patterns that we're seeing with abortion pills of people taking this into their own hands to manage their own health, to manage their own futures for their gender identity. So I'm going to end there because I feel like I've probably gone a little bit over time. But hopefully that's kind of giving a bit of the reading, the reproductive governance reading into a bit of kind of geographical context. Yeah, sorry, did I miss something in chat? France, yes, the letter went out in France. It's been in the news this week. So if you just Google letter to 29-year-olds in France, you can find lots of horrible information about that. They are sending out to men as well as women, which I was a bit surprised at. They probably thought it was a bit too on the nose to just send it to women, but we all know who it's really aimed at.
Mm.
So yeah, that's it from me.
Thank you, Cordy. Wow, gosh, okay. Great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so before we turn things over to you guys to hear your examples, I'd just like us to just pause for a moment and think about some of the issues that Cordy has introduced to us. And we're going to do that through the lens of Judith Butler's latest book, Who's Afraid of Gender? So I turned to this book while trying to make sense of what feels like a pretty kind of overwhelming, frightening political moment. I think, like many of us, I've felt pretty damn scared about the regressive kind of attacks that we've seen on gender, on sexuality, bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, trans lives across the globe. So whilst I'm not promising that this book offers any kind of definitive answers or explanations, I do think that some of the ideas in it help. They've certainly helped me to understand kind of what connects a whole host of seemingly quite different phenomena. Um, yeah, okay. So as Cordy's talked about, in different ways across the globe, we're seeing the erosion of hard-won rights and freedoms. So Cordy's touched on trans identities being invalidated, access to reproductive health care being restricted. There's also, of course, rights um, to marriage and sexual lives being challenged, healthcare being denied to trans people, sex education is another thing that's being curtailed. So across different contexts, lives and livelihoods are under pressure. So Butler's book, I think, offers several really compelling arguments that we can use to sort of start to untangle what might be going on. So they argue that these different issues are linked by what they call the phantasm of gender. And this is a constructed and exaggerated idea of gender, which becomes the object of different fears, essentially. And then to unpack this idea of the phantasm of gender, Butler, well, they do lots of things, but that one of the things that I was very interested in and is useful for our purposes on this course is they draw on different imaginaries of the body. So they draw on different ways of imagining what bodies are, what bodies mean, what bodies are allowed to do. And I think thinking with these imaginaries helps us to understand something about how fear is being mobilized and how that fear is being translated into policy, into some of the changes that Cordy's just introduced us to. Okay, so come back up to do this. Great. Okay, has that just moved on okay for you guys? Yeah, lovely. Okay. All right. So as I read through Butler's book, I found it helpful to pull out for myself kind of several different bodily imaginaries that operate as a lens for thinking through our contemporary moment. So I've got here the body as a site of social anxiety, the phantasmatic body imagined as sort of fragile and easily corrupted, the phantasmatic body as imagined as passive and porous, the body weaponized as something to be regulated by the state. And then they also have the body as knowledgeable, and they have the body as a site of collective resistance. We won't have time to work through all of these today. I'm going to really just focus at the top of the list on the body as a site of social anxiety. But I thought I would mention them all because we might link back to them when we come to more discussion towards the end of the session. So, yeah, the body is a site of social anxiety. So I want us to think about this because I think it will help us to think together about a question that's really, I think, at the crux of who's afraid of gender. And that question is, why has the gendered body become such a powerful site where fear and anxiety are being concentrated right now? Why has the gendered body become such a powerful site where fear and anxiety are being concentrated right now? Okay, so let's think a little bit more about this. So the gendered body is a site of social anxiety. So Butler's starting point here is actually quite simple. It's really powerful, but it's quite straightforward. They're saying that gender has become a kind of container where, or like a site or maybe a site's a better word, where fear congeals. So I'm just going to read out the quote on this slide. So they say, of course, there are many completely legitimate reasons to fear our world today. There is climate disaster, forced migration, lives imperiled and lost in war. There are neoliberal economies that are depriving people of basic social services that they need to live and thrive. There is systemic racism that takes the lives of so many through both slow and quick forms of violence. Women, queer people, and trans people especially those who are Black or brown, are murdered at appalling rates. So in this slide, they're clearly outlining the ways that so many of us across the globe are living in different ways through terrible things, through climate disaster, through global pandemics, through the rise of neoliberalism, the decimation of public and social services, the increasingly precarious nature of work, the withdrawal of rights to be protected. So we're living with a sense of increasing indispensability of our lives, a kind of sense of an induced precarity to our lives. So they're arguing that, in their words, these are difficult times to be alive. And of course, the more marginalized you are, the more difficult it is. Okay, so there's another long quote here. It essentially just sort of reiterates what I've just been saying, but in a more articulate way. But I'm going to read it out because I think it's important. So they're saying here, many of us live with this sense that our lives too are dispensable, or could become so at a moment's notice, or eventually that we could find or already have found ourselves with unpayable debts, bound to banks for life, securing their profits without being able to afford shelter. And what about all of us who do not know whether the future will provide affordable or accessible healthcare or any prospect of stable work that would secure the conditions of life for ourselves and those with whom we are interdependent? So again, Butler's naming a shared condition of precarity that is pervading the globe. They're describing a pervasive sense of lives being contingent, fragile, potentially disposable. And of course, the reason that this is a global phenomenon, they go into obviously a lot more detail than I'm able to go into now about the kind of nuances and the differences across the globe. But there is a global phenomenon that they're describing. And the reason that it's a global phenomenon, they say, is because it's arising from structural conditions. So it's being produced through economic and political systems that are creating this uncertainty, this precarity, this fear. Okay, so here their argument is that there are other fears on the right. So their point is that we all share some fears, but in addition to the fears that I've just discussed, on the right, there are also fears about challenges to patriarchal power and the social structures within the state, civil society, and the heteronormative family unit, waves of migration that threaten traditional ideas of nationhood, white supremacy, and Christian nationalism. If we have more time, we could talk at length about where these fears come from, what's motivating them, what their political effects and impacts are in different contexts, in our various different parts of the globe and beyond. But I think for our purposes today, the crucial point that I'm trying to get across is that Butler's saying we're living in anxious times, and that these anxieties move in so many different directions, and many of which are apparently exercising extraordinary powers of destruction against some of the most kind of vulnerable and marginalized people in our societies. Yeah, so Butler says, so many of us across the globe are living with a sense of ambient death that we neither know how to, we know neither how to mark or how to mourn. Okay, so Butler's really clearly identifying fear as a motivating force for the things that we're seeing, the changes, the atrocities that we're seeing across the globe. And they define what they call the phantasm of gender as a way of describing the figure or sight. I'm not sure quite what the right word is there. I think figure or sight for now, where the contemporary fears are, in their terms, congealing. And they argue that the phantasm of gender is being leveraged by right-wing movements to serve a project of restoring the world to a time before gender, which promises a return to a patriarchal dream order that may never have existed, but that occupies the place of history or nature, an order that only a strong state can restore. Okay. How are we doing for time? Okay. All right. Let's move on. Um, so in other words, this phantasm of gender, um, which is emerging out of various different kinds of fear, according to Butler, is being inflamed by a moralizing campaign from the right, which would include states, church, politics, and it's being kind of inflamed and used to pursue its agendas. Um, so it's this that Butler's arguing that is leading to the global rolling back of progressive legislation. So it's this that Butler is arguing is leading to the things that we heard about from Cordelia earlier, relating to reproductive rights, rights of women, rights of trans and non-binary people, gay and lesbian freedoms. Um, it's this phantasm of gender that's leading to the denial of the very existence of already vulnerable groups, stripping people of rights, restricting basic freedoms. And Butler argues that that there's a reason that it's gender that is attracting these anxieties, that these anxieties are congealing around what they call the phantasm of gender. They're congealing around gender because, and this is another quote. They say gender designates, even in everyday imagination, some way of living the body. So life and the body constitute its field of operation. So in other words, gender is feared because it names embodied life itself. So as Butler goes on to explain, um, I haven't included this quote on the slide, but I'll read it out. They say, this is on page 8, so hopefully you've read it. They say, bodily life is bound up with passion and fear, hunger and illness, vulnerability, penetrability, relationality, sexuality, and violence. And because the body is already a site where sexual anxieties and social norms cluster, social and political struggles find a ready location there. So that's why gender, rather than something else, becomes such a powerful site for fear. That's why it's kind of attracting these anxieties, because gender relates directly to intimacy, to sexual life, to the kind of limits through which people live and imagine, including all the kind of possibilities and prohibitions that right now feel so particularly vivid and frightening. So the body is central, it's crucial. And because these anxieties are kind of congealing around gender as a way of living the body, the phantasm of gender is working in the realms of the unconscious, the bodily, the felt. And that's one of the ways in which it's taking such a powerful hold. Okay, so what can we do? So, firstly, we can do exactly what we're doing here today. We can talk and we can think together about what's going on. Yeah, instead of letting these fears, these things that are happening, kind of live in the realms of the body and the unconscious, instead of kind of looking and then looking away, as Butler says here on the slide, we can bring them to the surface and we can think through them together. We can explore them together. And Butler says that by talking and thinking, by educating ourselves, by thinking and feeling together, we might begin to, in their words, deflate the phantasm in the service of another way of imagining. And here they're thinking about a way of imagining that is grounded in solidarity, interdependence, collectivity. So Butler says we need this way of imagining solidarity going forward as much as we need air to breathe. So your bridging activity for this week is on the right-hand side of this slide. So hopefully you're all familiar with this. It was to notice a moment or a space where current discussions or tensions around gender feel palpable in your environment, and then to bring that example to the session. So hopefully you've all come prepared with an example.